Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today I was going to do a reaction video. I downloaded this great new software, but unfortunately the audio on it doesn't want to cooperate with my mic. So I'm gonna have to get a new mic specifically for the computer. But I have a treat for you. We're going to do a look through of an encyclopedia that I've had for many years now, but the encyclopedia is from 1910. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to see what we can find in it. I've earmarked or bookmarked two particular entries that are very general, but I think that will be nice to look at. And then if we have time left over, if this video doesn't go too long, we'll look through it on sort of an ad hoc basis and see what we can find. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to drag you over here, if you'll excuse me. I know the production video on these are quite shit, but, you know, I do what I can. So, let's see. There we go. Let's open the book. There's a note written in here. Mrs. I can't read what that says. Something... It was her book, left with me in 1921. So that was written there, right there, 100 years ago. And that's one of the great things about these old books, is you can find people's marginalia in there. And the marginalia is as interesting to me as the book itself. So this is Webster's 20th Century Encyclopedia. And it was published, as you can see, in 1910. It says it was published in Chicago. That's where I found it. I got it at a secondhand store called the Brown Elephant that's there in Chicago. And the Brown Elephant, if you're ever in Chicago, you should check it out because they have a lot of really amazing finds. And every purchase goes to benefit the Howard Brown Center, which is the LGBT health clinic there in Chicago. So let's go ahead and get started. There's an editor's note here at the beginning that I want to read through. I want at my elbow while writing 3 books, a dictionary, an atlas, and an encyclopedia of the not over 3 volumes. One would be better. And that was said by Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was a very famous journalist in 20th century or 19th century America. And apparently having one encyclopedia was the expressed wish of the eminent editor Horace Greeley, a practical, busy man controlling the editorial policy of one of the most influential newspapers of his day and time. It was needed that all classes of information should lay before him in convenient form. The dictionary and the atlas were both realized during the period of his activities, but years elapsed before 16,000 encyclopedic subjects could be handled comprehensively within the covers of one volume. Here we have it. So, you know, each generation, each era has its own innovations and its own technological advances, and I think that we often forget that. You know, we kind of think of ourselves as being the only ones who have ever, you know, enjoyed technology. But of course, at one point, the printing press was new. At one point, the telephone was new. And this was cutting edge technology that revolutionized the way that people lived. I'm not saying that this encyclopedia right here is the equivalent of what the internet did. But the internet, you know, it certainly represents a leap forward in the compiling of human knowledge and in, you know, making people's lives just a little bit easier. And so that's really interesting that, you know, we take for granted things like the encyclopedia, but at one point they were brand new and revolutionary concepts. So it's always nice to be reminded of that. You know, and this encyclopedia here, look, it's tattered, it's falling apart, but it's 111 years old. So here's the first page. You can go ahead and take a quick look at that. But what I want to do is switch to, I've earmarked 2 entries. This one is Britain, or Great Britain. So you could probably guess the other one is the United States, and this needs to be moved over a little because this isn't. There you go. I want to make sure it's in shot. So we're going to look at those, and then maybe we'll have a flip through. I think that that'll be fun. So, and I'm going to try not to knock this over, but I do need to kind of come a little bit closer. Britain, or Great Britain. The island consisting of the three countries England, Scotland, and Wales, the name being also used as equivalent to the British Islands collectively, or the British Empire. So this is the Age of Empire, 1910. And that's one of the amazing things about this encyclopedia, is it really gives you a snapshot of the world as it was. You know, obviously they have entries on historical events. I'm sure if I looked up the Battle of Hastings that there would be an entry for it. But what's really fascinating isn't so much the historical events or even the scientific entries. Like, you know, on the first page there was one for aardvark, the animal. It's these things that tell you about life in 1910. And that's one thing you need to realize whenever you're handling a primary source, is that it tells you not about the era it is writing about. So, for example, if you want to use Gone with the Wind as a primary source, Gone with the Wind does not tell you about the Civil War. Gone with the Wind tells you about the 1930s, when it was written, when the film was made. This encyclopedia, if I looked up any entry in here on history, it's not going to tell me about that period. If I want to find out about, you know, Napoleonic France, I'm not going to look in here. I'm going to look at something that was from Napoleonic France, from that era. This is going to tell me what people in 1910 thought about Napoleonic France. So that's really a valuable lesson, I think, that most people who are just starting out in any sort of historical research really should know, is that primary sources tell you about the era in which they were created, not the era in which they purport to be about. So the British Islands, let's see, where were we? The name being also used as equivalent to the British Islands collectively or to the British Empire. Great Britain and Ireland with their connected islands form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Okay, so Ireland would not become an independent country until, when was Irish independence? Let's look that up real quick. I think it was 1921. Let's see. Yeah, 1921 with the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So that's going to be 11 years later. So this is 11 years before the Irish Free State was formed. That's really interesting. And I mean, so again, that's one of the great things about primary sources, is they can tell you about the world in which they were created. And it's kind of odd for us to sit here in 2021 and think of Ireland as being part of the United Kingdom. Now, obviously, Northern Ireland still is, but, you know, 100 years ago, this year, the Irish Free State came into existence. Wow. But when this was created, Ireland was still, I suppose, a constituent country of the United Kingdom, although I think the Irish would probably tell you they felt more like a colony. But let's continue. The British Islands form a kind of archipelago in the northwest of Europe. Well, I would say they do form an archipelago. Principal islands of Great Britain and Ireland, separated from the Irish Sea. That hasn't changed. The Irish Sea is still there. Some things don't ever change. That's just geography. The northern part of Britain, and it just says the N, but I'm assuming that stands for northern, for the most part is rugged, mountainous, and barren, this being the character of much of Scotland. The chief feature of the southern portion is the mountain mass of the Grampians, the culminating point in which Benevis, I'm sure I'm butchering these names. Is it Benevis? It's Benevis, right? Anyway, we're going to skip this part. I don't care about the geography. The geography hasn't changed a whole hell of a lot in 111 years. The principal cereal crops grown in England are wheat, barley, and oats. Oats now covering the largest area. The principal grain crops are turnips, potatoes, mangolds, vetches, etc. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know what a mangold or a vetch is. If anyone does, please let me know. In Ireland and Scotland, oats are by far the principal grain crop, by far the chief green crop being in Ireland potatoes, in Scotland turnips. Hops are grown to a large extent in Kent and less extensively in some other parts of southern England. This is interesting. So let's listen to this. Britain, next to the United States, is the most important commercial country. Now, I can't help but to think there's a little bit of jingoism at play here. Certainly by 1910, and keep in mind that this is an American encyclopedia. It was published in Chicago. Certainly by 1910, the United States was a major power, and it was certainly an economic giant. I don't know, when you consider the whole of the British Empire in 1910, if you can say that it was second to the United States in industrial might or commercial might. Now, if you just take Great Britain and Ireland, what would be the United Kingdom, together, perhaps, I don't know. But I'm skeptical. Let's see, let's keep going. Britain's exports exceeded $1.8 billion. I'm assuming those are US dollars. It's a safe assumption. And its imports were $2.9 billion annually. I wonder what they are today. I'm guessing a lot more, especially adjusted for inflation. Every form of religion enjoys the most complete toleration, but there are two churches, one in England having an episcopal form of government, and one in Scotland with a Presbyterian organization established by law and partly supported by state endowments. That's still true to this day. People kind of forget that Britain has established religion, but it does. In Ireland, there has been no state church since 1871, when that branch of the Anglican Church there established was disestablished. The great majority of the people are Roman Catholics. Still true in Ireland. For higher education, there are in England the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, London, Durham, Birmingham, and Liverpool. Victoria University, Manchester, the University of Wales, also colleges, some of them called university colleges, at Newcastle, Nottingham, Bristol, etc., besides institutions giving a university education in one or more departments, the training institutions for teachers, and the colleges belonging to the different religious bodies. London University, which till 1900 only held examinations and conferred degrees, is now a teaching institution embracing University College, King's College, etc. In Scotland, there are the universities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and St. Andrews, the last with a college at Dundee, St. Mungo's College, Glasgow, theological colleges, normal schools, etc. Ireland has the University of Dublin, the Queen's Colleges of Belfast, Cork, and Galway, in connection with the Royal University of Ireland, which is merely an examining and degree-conferring body, the Roman Catholic University, and Maynooth, and the other Roman Catholic colleges. So this is interesting because the Russell Group universities, only a handful of them are mentioned. I mean, where's Sheffield, for example? So when was the University of Sheffield established? Its history traces back to the foundation of Sheffield Medical School in 1828, Firth College in 1879, and Sheffield Technical School in 1884. University College of Sheffield was subsequently formed by an amalgamation of the three institutions of 1897 and was granted royal charter as University of Sheffield in 1905 by Edward VII. I'm reading Wikipedia there. I was just curious. I have a friend who is studying at the University of Sheffield. He did his undergraduate there, and he's doing his PhD now. So that's sort of my touchstone for anything outside of Oxbridge is Sheffield. It's interesting that it's not even mentioned here, though. So by 1910, it had only been a university for 5 years. And of course, the polytechnics wouldn't come until way later in the 20th century. There we have the earliest inhabitants of Britain. The area of the British Empire is about 11,000. The text is, or 11 million square miles. The text is faded, and I don't have my glasses on. Under the name of constitutional and hereditary monarchy, the government of Britain is vested in a sovereign and the two houses of Parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Laws passed by these houses and assented to by the sovereign become the laws of the land. But under this general fixity of form of center as real power, many change, or blah, 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 blah. But under this general fixity of form, the center of this general real power may change greatly, as it has in Great Britain within the last 2 centuries. The sovereign's right to veto on acts of Parliament has practically passed into destitute, while the 2 legislative houses of the House of Commons, from it being the expression of the national will as a whole, has become the real center of power and influence. That's true. That did. You saw over the course of especially the 19th century, but starting in the 18th century, the sort of transfer of real authority from the crown to Parliament. And certainly by the time that this was written in 1910, that had largely been solidified. There would be a few acts that would go a ways to making that a little bit more formal in the 20th century. But generally speaking, it was already established that Parliament was supreme and that, they exercised regnal authority on behalf of the crown. So that's interesting, though, that the Americans thought that it was worth noting that. There we have the British Army. It had 270,128 men. It had 42,140 horses. Doubt it has that many now. It has a war footing of 1,315,000 men, 98,040 horses, and 1,764 guns. That's really interesting when you think that this was written 4 years before the outbreak of the First World War. And when you think about the fact that the First World War was fought with, machine guns and tanks, and how little horses actually mattered in the grand scheme of things, it shows you how little awareness I think people had in 1910 of the realities of modern warfare and what the Great War, as it would become known, was going to look like. I don't think that people really understood how technology was going to change warfare and make it even more brutal and more bloody and ultimately more lethal. And that was actually one of the great lessons of the First World War, is that suddenly the battlefield tactics of the 18th and 19th century were obsolete in the face of this new technology. And this entry right here really goes to show that people in 1910, which again is 4 years before the outbreak of the First World War, they just did not know that. They did not have the foresight to understand how warfare was changing around them. And it makes you wonder what we don't have the foresight to see. What are we failing to recognize that has changed around our world? What will the encyclopedias of 2021 look like, and what will they get wrong, or what will they fail to predict or fail to understand or take account of when somebody is making a video like this, in 2032 or 2132. So let's see. That's about it. They don't have as much on Britain as I would have liked them to. British history since the Norman conquest is really a history of the progress of the world since that time in the arts and sciences. The principal events of its external political history, I'm sorry guys, I don't have my glasses on and it's hard to read at this angle, are the War of the Grand Alliance, in which the Duke of Marlborough commanded the British Army and which ended in the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. The loss of the American colonies, the consolidation of the Canadian colonies, the Napoleonic Wars, the acquisition of India, Australia, and parts of Africa, and the gradual territorial growth of the empire, the extent of which is described above. In 1900, the Unionist government appealed to the country on their South African war policy and received a majority of over 130. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, and was succeeded by her eldest son, Edward VII. In May 1902, the South African War ended, and Lord Salisbury soon afterward resigned the premiership to Mr. A.J. Balfour. Edward VII was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of August, 1902. In 1906, Sir Campbell Bannerman became premier, and on his retirement in 1908, owing to ill health, the premiership was assumed by Herbert H. Asquith. So, there you have it. I wonder if they have an entry on Asquith. I'm guessing probably not. And the reason I say that is when I was looking through here to kind of have a think about what to look up, I looked at William Howard Taft, who was the United States president in 1910, and they had just a tiny little entry on him. It was really surprising considering he was the sitting president, how small it was. We're looking for Asquith. It's Arkansas. So there's Asia. Nope, I don't think that they have an entry on Asquith. So, all right. Well, that was Britain, and that was 22 minutes of our time. So let's go ahead and flip to the United States now. Oh, this is heavy, and I want to be careful not to... You can see it's really falling apart. It was when I got it. So... Now this is interesting. When I was flipping through this, and I'm trying to get it to where you guys can actually see it. Let's see. The United States of North America, it says. And I find that very interesting because it's the only time I have ever seen the United States referred to as the United States of North America. Now, there may be American historians out there who have seen this before, and if so, feel free to correct me. But as far as I am aware, sorry guys, I bumped that. This is the only time I've ever seen it referred to that way. A federal republic occupying the whole of the central portion of that continent between, and it tells you the latitudes and the longitudes. And it kind of gives you a description of the geography. Now, what I want to look at here, instead of reading all of this to you, is look at some of these maps. And this is really annoying because I can't see as well as I would like, but I'm going to do the best I can. You can look here and see that it has a list of the states and the list of the territories. And the territories include Arizona, Hawaii, New Mexico. Down here you have Alaska. So all four of those are states now, but in 1910 they weren't. Of course, you have the Indian Territory, and it gives you a population of the Indians, as they say. as they term them. We might call them Native Americans now, although a lot of Native Americans, as we would call them, would prefer to be referred to by their actual tribes, because there is no, monolithic Native American culture. Each tribe has its own unique culture and heritage and traditions. But yeah, this is interesting. You can see the population. Here you have the cities, the most populous cities in the United States in 1910. New York was, as it is now, the most populous city in the United States. But number 2 was Chicago. And you have to come way down here, 20-something down, to find Los Angeles, right there, if you can see it. I think you kind of vaguely can see it. I know that this isn't the best, y'all, I'm sorry. But Los Angeles had a population of about 280,000. So you consider that Los Angeles, at the time, 280,000 people is nothing to sneeze at. It's not a small town by any stretch, but it's a far cry from the major global city, the entertainment capital of the world that Los Angeles is today. And so all of that happened over the course of the 20th century, which is really quite remarkable, I think, that a city could grow that fast, relative to its overall history. It's just, Los Angeles did in the 20th century what Chicago did in the 19th century. Chicago, wasn't founded until 1837, I believe was the founding of Chicago. And so when you think about how quickly Chicago became a global center of trade and commerce and art and culture, it's really quite remarkable. And if I'm right, in Chicago, let's look it up. When was Chicago? I'm pretty sure it was 1837. No. Oh, yes, it was incorporated as a city in 1837. It was incorporated as a town in 1833. But so by the time this is published, Chicago hasn't even been a city for 100 years, and yet it already has over 2 million people in it, which is roughly the population of Chicago today, I believe. So, it hasn't changed a whole lot. But that's really something. So let's keep looking at some of these tables. These tables are what's interesting. I don't want to read too much about, because this entry is so long. And obviously I'm not going to highlight anything in this book. So here you have coal-producing states. I noticed this was interesting earlier when I was looking through it, because Kentucky, which is where I'm from and is known for being coal country, was far from the most productive state when it came to coal. They only had about 9 million tons produced, closer to 10 million. But you look at a state like Illinois. Where's Illinois? Had 38 million tons. Which is something that I think, would surprise a lot of people. The coal industry in Appalachia. Now, I say that, but West Virginia produced 46,452,000 tons of coal. And this was 1906. So this was for the year 1906, which was 4 years before this encyclopedia came out. But you think about it, Appalachia was not producing as much coal as I think people would think in 1910. The coal industry in Appalachia grew over the course of the 20th century, and it really built itself up for about, I would say, 50 to 75 years before roughly the 1970s, 1980s, beginning the steady decline that we still see today. But by 1910, obviously, states like Kentucky and Tennessee, certainly Western North Carolina, were not producing probably as much of America's coal as you would expect. Now, Pennsylvania, on the other hand, was. You look here, you have 129,532,991 tons of coal, which the value at the mine was apparently $145,076,000, and that was in 1910. I don't know what that is adjusted for inflation, but a lot. So immigration. We have tables on U.S. immigration. Obviously, there's just a lot more information on the United States than the United Kingdom because this is an American encyclopedia. But immigration into the United States for the period of 1900 to 1907. Let's see, in 1907, it looks like there were over 1.2 million people, immigrants who came into the United States. I don't know off the top of my head how that compares to today. Immigration by countries in the fiscal year 1906 and 1907. This will be interesting. So where were these immigrants coming from? Well, let's look at 1907, just to make it simple. There were over 338,000 people coming from Austria-Hungary. Looks like there were 285,731 immigrants from Italy, including Sicily and Sardinia, it notes, in 1907. The Russian Empire and Finland had 258,943 immigrants to the United States that year. So the majority of them are coming from, looks like, Italy and Austria-Hungary and Russia, which includes Finland in this. Which isn't surprising when you think of the sort of demographic trends of America over the course of the 19th and 20th century. There were always waves of immigration into this country. In the 1830s, 1840s, there was a lot of Irish immigration. In the 1870s and 1880s, you started to see more Chinese immigration on the West Coast, which resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which were the first piece of anti-immigrant legislation in United States history. By the turn of the 20th century, you see a lot more Jews, European Jews coming in. I'm assuming, now I don't know, this is me speculating, that is, where the Austria-Hungarian immigration is coming from. The Russian immigration would constitute a lot of the Jewish immigration into the United States. It looks like there's 37,000 people from the German Empire, probably some from there too. But you also had a lot of Italian immigrants coming over around this time, and a lot of Polish immigrants came into the United States around the turn of the 20th century, which would be, just a little before this. I mean, by 1910, you're in the 20th century, but, around, I'd say between like 1880 and 1920, you had significant Polish immigration into the United States. So I wonder if that would be, they don't have a single line for it, obviously. I'm guessing that would be sort of carved up probably between, I would need to see a map of Europe in 1910 to know for sure. But I would guess that the Polish immigration would be represented in the German immigration and the Russian immigration. But don't take my word for that. How the map of Europe looked at any given time in 1910, or especially when you get into Germany, which sort of expanded and contracted over the course of, the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, it's a little hard for me to pinpoint exactly who controlled Poland at what point. Because Poland changed hands quite a bit. Here we have, this is interesting. We can come down here and see the number of immigrants. So this is all the European countries right here. They've grouped these by continent. And here you have Turkey and Europe. That's interesting. You don't really think about Turkish immigration to the United States. It's also interesting that they call it Turkey and Europe because, it was the Ottoman Empire at the time. Here you have Turkey and Asia. You have India. India had 216 immigrants to the United States in 1906 and 898 immigrants in 1907. We tend to think about Asian Americans having been relatively recent additions, to the sort of salad bowl or melting pot, whatever you want to call it, of America. But the fact of the matter is, there have been, Asians in what is today the United States for a very, very long time. I think the first Indian was documented as arriving in the British colonies in the 1700s. You want to check me on that, because I don't remember specifically, and colonial America is not my area of expertise, but I believe I remember reading that. And certainly in the mid to late 19th century, you saw Chinese and Japanese immigration to the U.S. West Coast. Now, Chinese immigration was significantly stymied by the Chinese Exclusion Acts and by really, really awful racism that Chinese immigrants experienced on the West Coast. And you can see here that, in 1907, there were less than 1,000 Chinese immigrants, but there were 30,000 immigrants from Japan. And of course, they settled mostly on the West Coast, but not exclusively. And you had Chinatowns and Japantowns sprout up in places like New York and Chicago. Here you have Africa. It looks like there were just under 1,500 immigrants from all of Africa in 1907. Hard to blame them, for not wanting to come here, considering Jim Crow and how we treated our own black people. Looks like there were just under 2,000 immigrants from Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. But nearly 20,000 immigrants in 1907 from British North America, which of course is what we would call Canada today. Mexico, though, only 1,406 immigrants in 1907 from Mexico. A fun fact is that the fastest growing immigrant population in the United States is actually not Latinos, but is Asian Americans. More immigrants are coming from Asia than from Central and South America in the current year of 2021, in the current era, I should say. I don't know exactly about 2021, but in our modern era, the majority of the fastest growing immigrant population is Asian in the United States, which I think is wonderful. I say, let everyone come. I don't care where you're from, you can come to the United States and you can be an American, and I think that's wonderful. The following table shows tobacco production by states for the year of 1905. Kentucky seems to have produced the most tobacco. Nope, I lied. Kentucky's just the first one that's mentioned. I guess they're ranked by farm value. That's interesting. So the value of the tobacco farms in Kentucky was the most, but they didn't produce as much as the value of, or as North Carolina did or Virginia did. I can't tell you why that is. I'm not an expert on... I probably knew at one point, actually, because I took one of the best classes I took in my undergrad was Kentucky History, taught by a brilliant, lovely, warm, funny, intelligent, just remarkable woman called Carol Crow Carrico, who I absolutely adore. And Kentucky History was one of the most important classes I took, and I'll tell you why. It's not because the subject matter was particularly relevant to my areas of interest, or that it is just so riveting. Although Kentucky does have an interesting history. And being from Kentucky, I was interested to learn about it. But it was important to me, and one of the best classes I took, because it taught me how to research. Kentucky History was the only time I really got to go into an archive and put on gloves and look at primary sources and hold them in my hands. So I was holding actual diaries that were written in the 19th century. I was holding actual, dolls that they had in the archives, different sort of primary sources, artifacts. And so that was the reason that I loved that class, is it really taught me how to research and how to handle primary sources. Obviously, I don't have the sort of museum training as somebody who handles these professionally, but it was a really great experience nonetheless. The The following table gives the production of ores, minerals, secondary minerals, and chemicals for the year of 1908, I believe that says. I don't have my glasses, so I can't see that far. We're going to go ahead and skip ahead. Fruits, looks like apples were the number one fruit, followed by peaches and nectarines, pears, plums and prunes, cherries and apricots. Looks like we had more cattle than we did horses. Okay, this video is already 40 minutes long. That's okay. I really only expected to make videos that were about 10 minutes long, and all of them turned out to be like, oh, so much longer. Yeah, I mean, this is giving you a history of the United States. This here says the most remarkable events of the colonial period were those connected with the wars which Great Britain and her colonies were obliged to wage with France, and which terminated in the cession of Canada to Great Britain in 1763 by the Peace of Paris at the close of the 7 Years' War. It's really interesting when you talk about the sort of 18th century colonial wars in North America, because they play such a, like the French and Indian War, which was part of the 7 Years' War, plays such a massive role in American history, and we really focus a lot on that. And then, of course, the American Revolution, the War for Independence. But from what I can tell in British history curriculums, the French and Indian War, as it's known here in the United States, and the American Revolution don't feature very much. The British were focused on a whole lot of other things at that time. And so it's interesting to me to do sort of a comparative look at what each country holds as important historical milestones, because obviously in the life of the United States and in the history of the United States, 1776 and the War for Independence is, you know, of the utmost importance. I mean, we have, you know, deified our founding fathers, and we have really built this whole mythology around 1776, whereas in most of the world it features as at most a sort of footnote in history. But of course, you know, that being said, I think that the American Revolution was incredibly important, not just because of, you know, the founding of the United States as a nation as we understand it today, but because it really put forth values of liberty and democracy in a way that had never been put forth before. Certainly not, I would argue, ever, but I guess some people would probably argue not since the Roman Republic. So, you know, others would say that the French Revolution really catalyzed those ideas, I think, in the minds of most people. But I think the American Revolution should get the credit because, you know, the French Revolution, how many republics are they on now? I mean, it took them a while to get it right. And it took us a while to get it right. You know, America, you know, I think I've talked about this in a previous video. You know, America was not exactly a paragon of democracy until really 1965. You know, not every American adult had the franchise until the Voting Rights Act was passed. But there has been some form of democracy in this country since its inception, and that is something I think, you know, that is worth noting and celebrating. Anyway, then it goes on to tell you about the Civil War. We're gonna skip some of that. I mean, this is the Civil War. I don't want to talk too much about. I mean, they have a whole. I guess it's not surprising that they have a whole section on the Civil War like this when you think about it, because the Civil War in 1910 was within living memory. I mean, that was 1865, you know, is when the Civil War ended, you know, and okay, so 1910, I mean, here we are in 2021. Certainly there are people alive who remember 1965, you know. So the Civil War was still within living memory, and it would probably be very interesting to read through all of this. We don't have time to do that right now, but we might do that another day. Let's see. All right, well, that seems to be it for the tables. Here you have territorial expansion of the United States. Lists the years. So the Louisiana Purchase, and that was 1803. Florida, followed by Texas, the Oregon Territory, the Mexican Cession, which was the land we conquered in the Mexican-American War. The purchase from Texas, Gadsden Purchase, Alaska, the Hawaiian Islands. Here's Puerto Rico mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in the territories earlier. The Pine Islands, Guam, the Philippine Islands, which of course were a United States colony for about close to 50 years, from 1898 up until the end of the 1940s. So, yeah. All right. So that's it. I mean, we might look through more of this as time goes on. I don't want to go too much longer because this video is already 45 minutes long, and that's ridiculous. But it's a really interesting encyclopedia because it tells us so much about the world in 1910, and that's what I love about primary sources, and that's what I love about antique books, is that they can tell you so much about the world in which they were created and the things that the people of those eras valued, which were not always the things that we ourselves value, and I don't think most Americans care much about. I'm going to kind of move you back over here now, sorry, so that I'm talking to you instead of anything else. But I don't think most Americans would probably think twice about, coal production. That might warrant an encyclopedia entry, but I don't know. But and of course, in 1910, it was crucially important because not only was coal a major resource and a major commodity, but it's how people heated their homes, and it's how people, even cooked their meals in some cases. You had coal-burning stoves, and so, it's interesting to look back and see what people thought was important, what information they wanted to include, and to see how the world has changed. For example, Ireland's a free country now. So, so it's really interesting. And you can look through this too, and maybe we will someday, but I want to be able to actually plan that ahead and see really some very, very racist entries. And so that needs to be looked through with care, but it's also worth looking at because it shows you how far we have come as a society. So that's the beauty of these old sources. This encyclopedia right here, I think I paid $10 for it at the Brown Elephant in Chicago probably about 8 or 10 years ago. And it's really brought me a lot of joy, and I've really enjoyed flipping through it over the years, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and if you want more content like this, or if you want history lectures, which I've put a couple on YouTube already, go ahead and click that subscribe button and ring that bell so that you get notifications whenever I upload new content. We're going to do some reaction videos coming up as soon as I can get the technology sorted. But in the meantime, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. And I look forward to seeing you all again. Bye-bye. Oh, I don't know where my thing is. See, I don't know the first thing about YouTube, so thanks for sticking around, y'all. Bye-bye. Did it work?